We have put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics.
I want to start this video off by saying that I have never lived through such a fraudulent election period, nor have I lived through such a politically and socially turbulent time in my lifetime. On the outset of the 2020 US presidential election, although knowing who our side was up against, I was still willing to accept the outcome, whichever way it went. Now, of course I despise Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, along with that anti-white cesspool known as the Democratic Party. But I did not want to allow myself to descend into the childish and delusional levels of a leftist, and reject a fairly elected president, as was done en masse back in 2016. This election, however, was anything but fair.
We need to find out exactly what happened in this election. And there are questions, and that means we have to answer them. For example, in Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Michigan, the Trump campaign has now collected signed affidavits that attest to criminal activity during the voting process. In the city of Detroit, witnesses have alleged, under oath, that ballots were improperly backdated and counted without matching signatures. One poll watcher alleges that 40,000 late unsealed absentee ballots were counted orally, and all of them went for Democrats. In the state of Nevada, 8 whistleblowers from within the Nevada Election Department say they witnessed voter fraud abetted by other election officials and by their supervisors. According to one affidavit, a poll worker saw people bringing handfuls of ballots to a Biden-Harris campaign van. Those ballots were then filled out at the van, placed in return envelopes. Eventually, Biden supporters formed a wall to block outsiders from seeing what they were doing. Meanwhile, according to voting records, people who were not even alive still somehow managed to vote on Tuesday.
I first started to hear about the possibility of widespread voter fraud days before the election. After election night, once it was almost certain that Biden was on his way to victory, and the calls for election fraud intensified, the mainstream media instantly started to downplay the quote-unquote conspiracy of voter fraud, while social media platforms attempted to shut down many of those who perpetuated it. The media then started to repeat the same approved talking points about how questioning the election results threatened the integrity of our entire election system, along with our very democracy. And it was at this point which prompted me to start my own independent research about this scandalous election. It's truly nauseating hearing leftists preach so virtuously about integrity, because the last thing they care about is the integrity of anything good or just. Because I know this much: when the left says something, the opposite is almost always the truth. Truth is not a left-wing value. So I did a very thorough investigation into this matter, and in the end, voter fraud was in fact a very real thing in this election. And is it really any coincidence that this scheme took place mostly in key battleground states, or that the overwhelming amount of ballots that were suspect or proven as fraudulent went for Biden? I don't think so. When you take into consideration who our opponents are, then it's no surprise. When election night rolled around, I'm sure the left had a long-lasting flashback at the horror that was the election of Donald Trump. At the time, they were completely caught off guard and utterly distraught at the results in 2016. This time, however, they knew what and who they were facing off against, and they came prepared. I'm more than sure that the Democrats and their media allies did everything imaginably possible to win back power, and I'm sure they will do just about anything to keep it this time. After all, it is the left, and the one and only thing they care about so much, to the point at which they would salivate over it, is power. It's in their nature. For practical reasons, I will personally accept the projected outcome of this election, and Joe Biden as the winner. Because whether I like it or not, he will serve as the next President of the United States. But on official grounds, I will not recognize the results of this election because of the overwhelming evidence of voter fraud in its many forms, and the concerted effort by the media and the elites to downplay its significance or to outright deny it. Now, as for white Americans in this election, their numbers were both disappointing and disturbing, but were also kind of shocking too, I'll confess. While I can think of a few reasons as to why some white Americans may have chosen to switch camps, I did not at all expect the voter turnout we got among our demographic this year. Now, before I lay out the numbers and figures for my viewers, I should mention that these numbers may not exactly be on point. They might vary by 1 or 2 percentage points when comparing to other sources, as votes are still currently being counted and assessed during the production of this video. With that said, in 2020, just as in 2016, about 58% of white folks voted for Donald Trump. So the president's numbers did not even budge by a single digit over the past 4 years with his main voting bloc, a result I did not expect. When we dive into the white Republican electorate, the numbers appear to look very similar to what they were in 2016. Among white men, 61% of them cast their ballots in favor of Trump, down from 62% last election. As for white women, however, their votes for Trump shockingly tallied up at about 55%, up from 52% in 2016. 2 more results I was not counting on. Even among college-educated and non-college educated white Americans, both of their numbers remained the same for the most part, with only some minor changes. All in all, for each category, despite some ups and downs, white America's numbers seem to remain relatively stagnant. But when you plug in the 2 major events that transpired throughout much of this year into the equation, the COVID crisis and especially the BLM riots, along with all the anti-white marches and slogans, and the toppling of our historical statues and monuments, fully on display, I expected a major eye-opener among white conservatives, and even the so-called moderates. The only considerable gain that came out of our demographic this year came from white women, which is really ironic. I truly anticipated our numbers, especially among white men, to increase by a few percentage points at the very least, rather than remain the same or decrease. What this tells me is that white conservatives in this country, by and large, are unmoved by the openly hostile rhetoric, events, and movements waged against them.
Wake up, motherfucker, wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Wake up, motherfucker, wake up!
So what does this all mean? Why do they continue to vote in the numbers they do? Why is it only our demographic in this country that bends over backwards to oppose its own collective interests? How can we spell out this phenomenon of white America that has been ongoing for decades? I think there are 2 factions among the current 41% of white Americans that cast their vote for the anti-white Democratic Party in 2020. One faction making up the overwhelming majority, and the other the minority. The overwhelming majority of those white people that vote Democrat every year would be the white allies and leftists, whose motives are quite clear. America is a deeply racist and oppressive country. White people are the devils of humanity. It's time for us white folks to cough up our reparations. We need to do our part to liberate the poor, oppressed minorities, and we need to sacrifice ourselves to eradicate systemic racism and white supremacy from this country. The white allies are on the front line in the left's effort to dismantle and fundamentally transform this country. And I can say this confidently: without the religious devotion of these fools to the left's campaign, its cause would not be anywhere near as successful as it is now. Prior to our present-day multiracial and multicultural melting pot, the white allies were, and still largely remain, the lifeline to Marxism in America. And I can bet that the left would not have been able to make the radical and sweeping changes it did over the past half-century without the popular support from white America. As for that small minority within this group, it would likely be comprised of a mix of white voters, mainly being that of swing voters, those who are dissatisfied with Republican policy, or those who are frustrated with the current system or administration and are seeking change. But in 2020, however, I think this small bunch might have found a few additional reasons to walk away from the Republicans, and I'm pretty sure it had very little to do with the party and pretty much everything to do with Trump. Whether or not Trump did any good for the country, that mattered much less to them. The COVID crisis and its effects definitely had an impact on his re-election, mainly the hit to the economy. But that was a relatively recent development, however, as the economy was doing pretty well prior to the whole fallout. And one would think that if Trump could build up the economy once, his voters would trust him to do it again. But in my view, what really drove those swing voters, as well as some of his own supporters, out of Trump's arms this time around, was primarily his character, as trivial as that may sound. I've read and watched many times over, both during the 2016 campaign, as well as throughout his presidency, in which many swing voters, even along with some of his own supporters, who consistently complained about Trump's character. Their complaints mainly highlighted his attitude, his very impulsive and reactionary behavior, the often childish ways of how he deals with people and things with which he has staunch disagreements with, and his constant rants on Twitter. Most of the switchovers were likely convinced that Trump's rhetoric was either the cause of the racial conflicts, along with the general division the country has experienced over the past 4 years, or that he highly exacerbated it. Assumably, by voting for an establishment candidate such as Joe Biden, they hope to calm the civil unrest and to pipe down the crazy rhetoric. In other words, to return to some state of normalcy. On a personal note, to a large extent, I would agree with these complaints. When it comes to President Trump's character, I too can find many, many flaws that often work against him, which, if corrected, it would benefit him and his image greatly. In my opinion, I would agree that he generally tends to be rather impulsive, pompous, and combative in his behavior. And sometimes he does tend to talk a bit too much, both in person and on Twitter. On the other hand, I also find many of those same qualities, as flawed as they may be, beneficial to him as a leader, some of which would be his very high energy despite his age, and his ability to put up a fight and to not back down, no matter his opponent. On the other side of the aisle, we have the white conservatives and Republicans. On this side, I would also split them up into a majority-minority grouping. In short, the overwhelming majority in this group are just simple patriots. Those who want to defend our nation, our institutions, and our defining values. The majority of white conservatives have no sense of their own in-group racial interests. They are not racially conscious folks, like most of white Americans. They, at most, vote for the well-being of their neighborhood or their community, on issues like taxes or public education. The minority within this group are also patriots, and also vote for similar causes. But along with that, this very small minority, which would be our community, the nationalist community, is also racially conscious and actively votes in favor of the interests of not only our nation, our history, and our values, but also our people. As for our numbers, well, I'm honestly not sure on that. When you consider all the immense public, social, media, cultural, and reputational pressures thrown at us on the daily, it is impossible to know just how many of us are out there. Most of us are always in hiding, and understandably so. I hear lots of people within the nationalist community, especially in recent years, that have a more optimistic take on our situation, stating that there are more of us out there that are waking up every day to the madness, but that they are just in hiding. I tend to be a bit more on the skeptical side. I could say that more white conservatives have become more racially conscious over the past 4 years, not because of Trump, but because of the left's intense anti-white reaction against Trump and his supporters. But regardless, I think we still have a lot of work to do to wake our people up. My personal estimate, in terms of percentage, would probably be as low as 3 to 5%, but maybe as high as 7%. However, based upon the outcome of this latest election and the priority issues among Republican voters, I have very little faith that our people reach even 5% of the vote. Remember, these numbers are not applied to every single individual that voted for Trump this year. I'm talking strictly among the 58% of white Republicans that voted for the president. In solid numbers, out of the tens of millions of white Americans that cast their ballot for Trump, racially conscious white Americans, I would say, would arguably make up somewhere between 2 to 4 million within our electorate. Considering how staggeringly low our numbers appear to be, I am avidly convinced that either these folks are not aware of the poisonous anti-white movement growing against them in this country, or that they are conveniently sticking their heads in the sand to this reality, only focused on themselves, their families, and their neighborhoods, along with their financial stability. So long as they are secure and comfortable with their lives, they won't burden themselves with what is going on outside of their tight communities. The conservative establishment, meanwhile, was busy spending all of its time and all of its money pandering to the minorities, and entirely abandoning its main voting base, white Americans. Tells us a lot about the Republican Party today and where it's headed. The conservative leadership has already accepted its fate in the cultural and demographic war. They had their choice to either stand behind America and its people or power, and it looks like they've decided that appeal and power is far more integral to their legacy. They turned their backs on us by turning left. When was the last time any of you have ever heard a Republican politician or official even utter the word white, let alone trying to defend us or looking out for our well-being? The only time I have ever heard the word white being spoken by any of our representatives is when they are shaming or condemning us for thinking in racial terms or deviating from our modern norms of diversity and mass immigration, such things they label as racism and white supremacy. There is no, and will never be, a politician or party that explicitly caters to the interests of white Americans under this current social and political climate. The only support we're ever going to find is among ourselves, and it's time for us to start acknowledging and acting on that fact. So how long until our people finally start to wake up to the grim reality unfolding in this country? It's hard to say exactly. I'm sure many of them will wake up as the mob marches closer to their doorstep, beginning to see more plainly what their true motives are. But as for millions of other white Americans, I don't think they can be saved. If the recent events that have transpired across the country have not been enough to shake them to their core yet, nothing will be. The anti-white virus has tainted their minds past the point of no return. Any white American that still believes that there's a future for us in this country is a fool, a dead fool. The only future for us is separation. The vast majority of white Americans are likely to remain complicit or passive for many more elections to come, until we finally begin to think of ourselves as one people with a common set of interests, a common set of enemies, and a common destiny. Our future will remain bleak. All we can do, as the few enlightened ones, is sound the alarm and prepare for the turmoil that lies ahead.